I've always been a big believer that Blue Lock is far more about the player's mindsets and psychology than the football itself. And while some of the other characters are used to explore other angles of Blue Lock's ideas or to highlight how Blue Lock's philosophy could be misused, Isagi has always been the shining example of someone who strikes a perfect balance in almost everything. Whilst I will come to where I think Isagi is going to go from here because I think that's a super interesting discussion, for now we're going to go back to the very end of the U20 match, where in front of a packed stadium, Isagi Yoichi scores the winning goal against his country's U20 team, taking the place of Kira in episode 1, who he could only look at with envy, someone in a different world to him at the time, but now he's the one being interviewed, being asked what his next goal is. And this is going to seem like I'm making far too big of a deal out of this, but I do find that slight delay and uncertainty from him in knowing what his next aim is going to be really interesting. I do think chapter 301 is setting something up here that could potentially flip the entire series on its head, that I'll talk about later, but for now at least, he's seemingly very honest about what he wants, with his declaration that not only will Japan win the U20 World Cup, but he will be the one to lead them there. Besides the size of the nuts on this guy, what's obviously interesting though is later on in chapter 285, he ends up throwing away that last part. When push comes to shove, he's actually more interested in winning alone than being the one to get the glory. It's not that he doesn't care about that at all, of course, but if he has to sacrifice it to win, he'll gladly do so. More on that later though. When it comes to him specifically declaring that he wants to be the one to lead Japan, I think this kind of honesty is super important, not just for being able to get fired up, but also just so that whatever you're aiming for actually makes you feel good when you reach it. I think we've all worked crazy hard for something, got it, and then realized like, oh, I actually don't really care about this, because we got influenced into wanting it despite it not really being for us. You know, we got pushed away from what we actually wanted for embarrassment or a million different reasons, but again, more on that later. The last thing I want to say on the U20 match is it's also really cool how this goal was basically a mirror of the last time Isagi lost to Rin, with the random deflection leading to a goal for the guy prepared to go for it. It's a small thing, but I personally find it really easy when something goes wrong to get too focused on the frustration of it instead of why it didn't go well, but that clearly wasn't the case for Isagi. But as a quick question for you watching this, really try and picture how it'd feel if you were in Isagi's shoes and found yourself suddenly thrust in front of national TV, with a stadium chanting your name and the eyes of your entire country on you. How would you feel? Terrified? Excited? Probably a mix of both. But it's not just that moment, but even in the following days where he's recognized and asked for autographs, it would have been extremely easy for Isagi to allow it to get to his head. Obviously either from fame and whatnot, but also worrying about continuing to live up to those expectations. There's obviously still quite a lot he lacks as a striker, and so it would have been pretty easy to allow that concern to build. But it's pretty clear from what follows that neither of those problems end up applying to him. Moving into the start of the NEL, we of course have Kaiser, the man who would throw Isagi into a borderline traumatizing rivalry for the rest of the league, immediately intercepting Isagi's shot in the first training drill to leave him with a score of 0. Besides the initial shock, this is a totally different dynamic to anything he's had so far. Sure, Blue Lock had this battle royale frenzy vibe to it, but all of his previous conflicts have had some degree of reasoning behind it, just born out of a rivalry of two people aiming for the same thing. In the case of someone like Barcha and Rin, they're just trying to get goals themselves. But this is someone intentionally, with no real benefit to themselves, going out of the way to effectively try and bully him, knowing they presently outrank him at the sport. And it's safe to assume that Isagi in return hates him back, or at the very least holds some anger towards him for trying to humiliate him. And this is all going to become much more significant later on. But that combined with Isagi ranking pretty lowly is enough to really start mounting the pressure on him. And I don't know about you, but in a situation like that, I'd be thinking to myself, oh, you know, I've just got up the intensity and grind really hard and do this so I can catch up to this guy. And that's probably quite a common anime trope, right? Like just get more fired up. Or alternatively, kind of sinking into self-pity a bit and kind of lamenting my own weakness. But Isagi does neither of these things. Even when presented with literal data showing how far behind everyone he is, his only response is to calmly look at what needs to be done, even going out of his way to ask his coach for advice. And Noah's advice does actually end up being pretty huge for him later on, but I'm aware I've spent quite a while on this video already, and we haven't even started the NEL. So going into the first match, the biggest thing on Isagi's mind here is this balance between idealism and realism. Since the very start of the series, Blue Lock has drilled into their heads to be more idealistic, to aim higher, specifically beyond what they previously thought doable, as Jinpachi believes they've all got way more potential than the current Japanese approach to football tells them. And it's pretty clear by now that he was absolutely spot on. A lot of them are capable of doing far more than they thought they were before they came to Blue Lock. But at what point does that idealism go too far? At what point are you aiming too high? Assuming that that is a thing. Blue Lock's answer seems to be that it's less about that, but more about not trying to force or rush it. Isagi doesn't start in the match as he wasn't ranked high enough according to the data. However, as part of Jinpachi's agreements with the sponsors that made the Neo Egoist League possible, Noah was forced to substitute him off. Unlike everyone else on that team who was put there because of their numbers, Isagi got through based on his previous accomplishment. And out of desperation to prove his worth to stay on the pitch, he attempts to force himself in between two of the very best players in the world, a play which immediately backfires with Lavinio using him as a human shield to slip past Noah and put Barcha 1-0 up. Now, thankfully he didn't know this was being televised to the whole world at the time, but Kaiser calls him out on exactly what went wrong here. Him and Barcha didn't charge in because they know they're not at the level of these guys yet. And I think this is pretty much the only time Isagi is guilty of this, of trying to force and almost shortcut his way into the team, instead of honestly looking at what needs to be done, and what he can and can't currently do. And that's quite difficult to do. You know, it's extremely easy to let that frustration of feeling behind, that desperation to catch up take over. But he soon realizes and accepts over the course of the next couple chapters the gap between him and Noah, and switches to a far more realist approach, accepting that he's currently incapable of scoring by himself. And this isn't a defeatist decision. It's not out of self-pity. For one, he's currently standing on a pitch with some of the best U20 teams out there. Even aiming for an assist is still a challenge, and that's exactly how he describes it. Which I think is super important for him, that in the face of something that seems too difficult, he's not just intimidated in returning to what he can already do. He's still pushing himself when he opts to aim for an assist through Kunigami, who brings the match to an end. And following this, Isagi's decision is fiercely contested by Yukimiya. And I spoke in depth about this interaction in a previous video, but the pair of them take two very different responses to the situation Isagi was in, with Isagi opting to do what he can right now and change his goal to something within his reach, and Yukimiya declaring that he'd never do that, he would have struggled on to try and get a goal himself, and if he failed, so be it, because he'd die before giving up on his ideals. And it's not quite as just simple as saying, he's right, he's wrong, because I think the answer as to which approach is correct for them comes down to which of the two ego types they fall into. So for anyone who hasn't seen Blue Lock, later on Isagi divides the world into self-style and world-style ego types, with self-style essentially being someone that focuses on their own personal interests and desires, even if those are incomprehensible or even irrational to the rest of the world. And a world style is someone who prioritizes measurable external results over everything else. Now in reality, this should probably be more of a spectrum than just a binary choice. You probably feel like you kind of fit into one and kind of fit into another, but we know that Isagi is far to the world star end of that spectrum. Obviously later on in the PXG game, willing to throw away everything that isn't just winning. So this kind of results-orientated decision is pretty in line of what he's aiming for. Obviously he's not really aware of that in the Barcha match, so there's still this real sense of dissatisfaction, but he's at least very honest with himself on that. I do also think Yukimiya claiming that Isagi's a coward for this is very unjustified, honestly. Sure, it was an easier task than trying to score himself, but trying to get Kunigami a goal was not an easy route, given that it was effectively a 2 versus 20. Which is super important, this wasn't a cop-up by Isagi, and after the match we see him talk about how next time he wants a goal himself, so it's not as though he's given up on that either. But for Yukimiya, things are a little different. We know he wants to become the greatest striker in the world, and refusing to compromise on that goal maybe isn't a bad thing on its own, but refusing to change your approach towards it certainly is. And if Isagi had taken on the same approach as Yukimiya, I honestly don't know if he would have even cracked Blue Lock's top 10 by the end of this arc, for reasons I'll talk about soon. However, I know, again, I've already spoken in depth about Yukimiya, so on the note of Kaiser calling him out and whether or not this is just jealousy, and whether or not these are actually his ideals or not, or if he's just giving to ugly, foolish, low-level emotions, which I think is basically him asking if Yukimiya is just saying this to try and be different to Isagi, to have something to call him out on, following his anger at Isagi stealing his spot. Going back to what I was saying before about Isagi being very honest with himself, is Yukimiya doing the same here, or is his frustration at not getting what he wants causing him to come up with all sorts of justifications for why Isagi, who has what he wants, is still somehow in the wrong here? But anyway, Kaiser offers Yukimiya a place following him, which I actually think would have been a fantastic idea. I think Yukimiya is honestly far more suited to more of a winger or something than a striker, given the amount of times we've seen him get past half a team on his own but not manage to score. But Yukimiya doesn't want to budge on his goal, which is of course fair enough, but that topic of jealousy and differing their approaches sets the stage very nicely for the Manshine game. With Manshine of course being the team of visualizing your ideal self and working towards it, and not being too reliant on your talents, having self-awareness of them but not being purely dependent on them. And immediately from kickoff we see the difference in some familiar faces. Ryo pulls off a copy of Sai's Nutmeg before firing off a copy of Rin's shot. Chigiri gets past about 5 players on his own to score from the edge of the box. Nagi finally uses physique and dribbling skills to start coming up with his own plays. It's pretty clear that everyone on Manshine is working towards a new ideal self, and following Chigiri's goal, he even explains that to Isagi exactly what he's doing. But what is Isagi's ideal self? What's his ideal playstyle? Back when Noah grilled him on it in 158, it's clear that he had a rough idea of what he wanted to look like, his direct shots combined with the brain and body to spot and capitalize on openings, but he didn't really have all the details ironed out, and he also didn't have a vision of himself that could be Noah, even hypothetically. Whereas these Manshine players have their ideal selves mapped out crystal clear for them, in Chigiri's case, even having the most precise angle and distance he wants to shoot from. It's significantly different from Isagi, who only really has this rough idea. But the uncomfortable truth is that when he first saw Kaiser a few chapters earlier in 162, he was beyond even Isagi's ideal self. The potent finishing ability that far exceeds Isagi's, combined with the ability to spot the needed openings, but on top of that, and crucially because this is obviously Isagi's big weakness, the ability to create his own openings once he has the ball. And I feel like I've spoken this a lot in other videos, but going back to the Manshine game, these next 3 chapters embody so much of what I love about Isagi's mindset so well. Exactly what you'd expect from Blue Lock's most iconic power-up. At the end of chapter 180, in the face of an utterly overwhelming rival, one currently so far beyond him, he doesn't despair or cower, but simply accept the difference and crucially, look at why it exists. Remember how I mentioned Kaiser's little speech about jealousy back in 171? I certainly know I'm guilty of this, like especially when I was younger, of seeing someone who had what I wanted and immediately coming up with some sort of mental justification for why it doesn't count or why I can just dismiss the fact that they're where I want to be. You know, like they're a jerk or they're just lucky or whatever, right? And it gets you nowhere. But Isagi doesn't do this. It would have been extremely easy for him to. Given Kaiser's arrogant attitude and repeated attempts at publicly humiliating Isagi, to just dismiss him as, oh well, he's got his team setting up, or he was just lucky to be born with the Kaiser impact, but he doesn't. Instead, Blue Lock's ace, the man who scored the winning goal against his country's finest, now accepts that he's just not able to score here. He's just not good enough right now. Instead, he opts to follow Kaiser and see what he's doing that he currently isn't. And interestingly, had he taken Yukimiya's approach and refused to settle for anything less than a goal, what follows may never have happened, which would have condemned Isagi to a much lower rank than he would have ended up with. As I mentioned earlier, I think Isagi without Metavision would probably have struggled to even make it into the top 10. But his willingness to put aside that jealousy, to be willing to stare the difference between him and his rivals dead in the face and find out exactly why it exists, gives Isagi a piece that he believes would let him take on the entire world. And also a super important thing is when he looks at Kaiser, he's fully aware that the Kaiser impact is not something he can copy. Let alone the fact that even Noah can't match its speed, it's just not Isagi. And I think this is something that took me way too long to realize myself. That when you look at someone who's got what you want, you're going to be able to learn how to do most of the things they do because you're both human, but not everything because humans vary quite a lot. And some people are going to be just naturally incredible at things that you're sadly just not. And I think being able to separate the two things without being overly pessimistic towards yourself is important. Obviously Metavision is the way Kaiser does something, whereas the Kaiser impact is more of just a skill that he's already got. And the very last thing I will say on that before moving on is there's a fine line between, looking at others and taking on what you can from them, and driving yourself absolutely insane in the process, where you're constantly seeing people do different things and it feels like you're never doing anything correctly. This never seems to happen to Isagi, which I think is in part because there's only so many things people can do in football, but depending on what you're using it for, that definitely can happen. This is why I haven't watched any gym content for ages, because it's all just, oh, you should do this instead, and it's very much at the point where it's more detrimental than beneficial. But anyway, returning to Blue Lock, with this new piece he's found, Isagi's very excited to put it into practice and immediately able to find success with it. It's extremely clear to everyone on the pitch that something has changed in him, as him and Kurina make their way past the entire Manshine team to leave Isagi clear on goal, only for Kaiser to show up and try and stop him, which if you've not read Blue Lock before, teammates getting in each other's way is just normal in this series, they just like to do that. But as a result of this, Isagi can't get a clean shot in, and once again, denied a goal due to Kunigami's theft, which I never actually noticed until now just how close he was to a goal here. The follow through of his foot is basically over the line. So now Isagi's reaction makes a bit more sense to me, I'd probably be pissed off too. Although probably not to the point of threatening to kill my teammates. This is by far the angriest we've ever seen Isagi in the series, the culmination of everything building up to this boiling point. And it sounds like I'm taking it a little too seriously, but I actually like that we see this from him. Obviously it's a little, much, and I can't imagine what the people watching from home thought, but I speak a lot about how I love Isagi's level-headedness and how he doesn't give in to things like jealousy, frustration, desperation, etc. But it clearly doesn't come from an absence of those things, right? There's times where it all bubbles to the surface, or in this case explodes, but he's then able to sort of calm himself and control himself and get back to it. And this also leads into another brilliant point. This is going to be a long video, but hopefully you're still enjoying it. But anyway, he's fully aware that he's not the only person who can use it, that others like Sai can as well. This is pretty much the flip side of what we said before. And that bit of humility is vital because being conscious that there's plenty of other people that can do the things he does stops him from falling into the same kind of trap Barcha did, where he just kind of demanded and expected to win on account of being talented and working hard, which obviously only gets you so far until you inevitably encounter people working equally hard and also working smarter, which is the crucial thing Isagi does here. His understanding that Metavision is incredible and he should be excited by it, but to keep going, he needs to figure out an even better way to use it. And that is exactly the basis behind his next evolution, the realization that everyone on the field sees themselves as the protagonist and wants to act in a way that gives them that protagonist feeling. There are those who will only be satisfied with a goal, those who'd rather be the one to pass. There are rational and irrational stories. And as Jinpachi said, Blue Lock is comprised of his story of creating the world's best striker, of Henri's story of winning the World Cup, plus the stories of Japanese soccer fans and the lumps of talent down on the field. Don't get drunk on your own story, don't get scared of the world, show me how you can spin together the stories that have fallen on the field. Obviously, the first half of that referring to Yukimiya, who in Jinpachi's words was trying to hopelessly believe in a story where he's the hero. I spoke about that a ton in my video on him, but essentially he didn't do what I mentioned Isagi does. He tried to force an opportunity where one didn't exist instead of looking at what needed to be done. But sadly, everyone else on that pitch has their own story. No matter how desperately you want something, the world doesn't warp in response to that. It's easy to get drunk in your own story and forget that like Yukimiya did, but Isagi, as usual, avoids a lot of the pitfalls that the other characters step into. He's constantly looking at what he is and isn't able to do, and obviously in the PXG game we'll talk about how he essentially changes his story from being the one to score the winning goal to simply the one who wins. But for now he has that realization, well, if me and Yukimiya have contradicting protagonist feelings, there's simply no way he can force him to agree with him. It's a very similar conflict to what he had with Barcha back in chapter 62. Barcha had his own story as a king, and Isagi trying to change that was simply a waste of time. It would only make him even more of a villain in Barcha's story, and even less likely to listen to Isagi. This idea is also obviously built on very nicely at the end of the Ubers match, where we finally get to see what it looks like when two teammates have the same protagonist feeling and want to live out the same story, but more on that soon. We then end up with Noah's second bit of advice to Isagi in 199. It's another chapter I really like, where after Isagi struggled to visualize his own goal due to his currently lacking physical specs, obviously again linking into what I said before about how he's very honest with himself, but when Noah declares himself Isagi's ally, the routes to the goal light up. He knows with certainty that all of these routes, yet still stresses over which one is the best. Until Noah tells him to be less greedy, that he can't do it all, so should instead focus on his strongest desire, which happens to be crushing Kaiser. If you remember earlier, I mentioned that it's easy to drive yourself insane by constantly looking at what everyone else is doing. This is kind of a similar thing, except he's looking at all the ways that he could do this. From Isagi's perspective, where he sees all these viable options to get to the goal, he doesn't have time for this analysis paralysis. Just picking one and going for it is going to work out way better for him. And once again, this is something I often remind myself of. If there's a billion different ways to do something, just pick one and start it instead of trying to find the perfect one, because it probably doesn't exist. And of course the game ends with Kaiser once again interrupting Isagi's shot. But Isagi didn't care. Just outmaneuvering him to get an assist was enough for him to get his first victory over Kaiser. And the man regarded as one of the best in the world for his age is forced to watch on in horror as Isagi finally throws his earlier words back in his face and claims his first small victory over him. And it all came, ironically, from abandoning his ego in the traditional sense of the word. You know, the way that me and you would have seen the word ego before reading Blue Lock. It came from being honest with himself that he was lacking a lot. It came from looking at those that he hated and seeing what he could learn from them. And above all, it came from the realization that everyone out here has thoughts just like he does. They train just as hard as him, and that doesn't guarantee any degree of success. He had to continue to figure out a way to get what he wanted. Now, the Ubers match I'm actually going to go through pretty quickly. I don't think there's a lot to say for this video compared to some of the other matches, but there's a lot to say about the PXG game afterwards. It's a brilliant match, but just that in terms of talking about Isagi's mindset, I don't think there's much to say that I haven't already. I also don't have too much to say about the interlude between games here. However, it's cool seeing Isagi being able to finally verbalize his ideal in 204 like Noah asked him to, and he's excited by the challenge of facing off against the new number one in Barcha. And there is of course the interview in 205 where he's asked if he wants to go into being a midfielder like BM wants him to, or continue to aim for being a striker. And honestly, I do think either one would have been fine. It's pretty clear that he'd be a great midfielder, But if he really has no interest in that and he's still able to grow and progress as a striker, then fair enough. I'm also not really going to talk about the whole developing the lefty shot thing because there's not really anything to say that we haven't already. He's still looking at what he needs to work on, etc. And there's a cool little point from Kunigami in 213, which feels like it mirrors a lot of what Prince said, in that Isagi wasn't considering the full picture and was just trying to almost blindly copy Kunigami without thinking about the ramifications. But there's not too much to say about Isagi in between the matches. And so jumping straight into the Ubers game, we obviously get to see Lorenzo's skill in action 210 and 211, but Isagi manages to get the first goal of the game with a counterattack in 212. Barcha equalizes in 216, and there's a lot to say in Barcha in this match. I've kind of spoken a bit about it in my video on Snuffy, but maybe we'll make another in Barcha in the future if people want. Kaiser makes it 2-1, and interestingly seems to have gone through something similar to Isagi. He couldn't score the kind of goals he wants to. He had to essentially kind of downgrade his target a bit and aim for just scoring no matter what due to Lorenzo hounding him. He could have stubbornly refused to stop until he found a way to get past Lorenzo on his own, which would have essentially been the decision Yukimiya made earlier, but that's not the choice he makes. Which I suppose in a way is kind of hinting at Isagi and Kaiser having their brains work in a similar way. Then Snuffy and Noah sub on, and we get a cool little bit of setup for the next game. Because it's immediately apparent to Isagi that whilst he isn't as flashy as Lavinia or Prince, Snuffy from behind the scenes is orchestrating attacks that feel impossible to stop. It might not be as obvious to those looking in from the outside, but to those with the football brain to see his impact, he's clearly the best on the pitch. Even Noah himself admits that whilst he may be the best striker, Snuffy is the best all-around player there is. But a crucial thing here is that he's able to shut down all of Blue Lock's players so easily. And this is specifically because of their egos and their own personal desires, whereas Snuffy doesn't have that extra noise himself. He's just purely focused on winning, which has evidently enabled him to win as many titles as he has, because that's all that matters to him, not trying to be the hero. And it's allowed him to shut down even Noah himself. However, this isn't the series making a U-turn on itself and saying that having a bit of ego or individual desire is a bad thing. We see from the Ubers players who are dutifully carrying out Snuffy's designs without much creativity of their own that it would have lost to Isagi if it wasn't for Barcha's rebellion. And there's quite a bit here in this one scene that all feels very in line with all of Blue Lock's ideas so far. Firstly, that Snuffy's rigid tactical approach of telling everyone to just follow his ideas and carry out their role is inferior to someone actively chasing a burning desire like Isagi or Barcha. He would then admit to Barcha that that goal wasn't in his designs, it was a win for his ego. However, above that is Snuffy's pure focus on winning, as opposed to winning where he gets to be the one to score. The difference being, this is an aim he's chosen for himself rather than just accepted from someone giving it to him. And again, obviously, it also just makes sense that it's a much easier task, right? To just win rather than win with you specifically being the one to score. But again, I spoke about this in my Snuffy video and will probably make a Barcha video soon, who grabs an equalizer and Hiyori substitutes on. And a lot of the remainder of the game focuses on him. Again, another character that definitely deserves their own video at some point. But whilst I do think this goal builds on a lot of Blue Lock's previous ideas, I think for this video, perhaps the only thing I could really say is that it's Isagi doubling down on his whole constantly looking for a new way to score if he's currently incapable of doing so. This time realizing that him and Hiyori have to go beyond even what's currently up on the field, syncing their visions of the world's best player and enabling Isagi to get the winning goal. And again, I know I really zoomed through that, but there's going to be at least 2 separate videos on that in the future. I just don't think there's too much to say for this video. However, I have a ton to say about the PXG game. In chapter 247, Jinpachi asked the Blue Lockers what their originality is, i.e. what they hunger for, what their strongest desire is. And following Shido's goal, in chapter 253, Hiyori and Isagi reopen that whole discussion from before about originality, breaking down the entire process. Your hunger becomes a suitable goal that excites you personally, chasing after it puts you in a flow state, and attempting to overcome that ultimate challenge causes your peak performance, a level beyond that. And this leads to one of the most interesting topics in all of Blue Lock in the 2 ego types. And I know I briefly mentioned this earlier, but I'm bringing it up again because whilst Blue Lock in general feels far more about the player's mindsets than football, this match in particular feels more like a battle to find the best mindset and the goals that excite the player the most. So again, we have the self-style who focuses and pursues his own pleasure and puts the world's rules secondary. They're not so interested in what the world will give them for doing something as they are how much they'll enjoy doing it. And the world style who wants to succeed by the metrics of the world and see that as more important than their own feelings or desires. Now in reality, at times you'll be forced to take the world style approach and reach certain metrics despite what you think of them. And also just only taking the self-style approach and only doing things that interest you right now probably isn't great either, because in reality you'll probably end up doing a lot of things which just aren't great for you. Likewise, it's probably healthy at times to take a break from just chasing numbers on something and do something that does interest you. But regardless, even though we're all probably both of these styles to some extent, there's probably one that appeals to you more than the other, one that excites you more. And the point Blue Lock repeatedly seems to make is that more than anything, that's what you should be pursuing, because being excited by it is more important than doing it in the most efficient way. For example, if we take Barcha, whose refusal to pass is obviously a ridiculous, terrible way to play the game, but because it draws out the top performance of such an incredibly skilled player, his team is still able to do well. Or in chapter 200, when Noah teams up with Isagi and he gets his protagonist feeling back. He notices how much more focused his mind is to a level that you couldn't force yourself to reach without that feeling. And you know, we've all experienced this, the difference between when you're working on something that you want to versus something that you're kind of forced to. And I spoke earlier about Isagi's slight delay at answering that question at the end of the U20 match. So the question is for Isagi, what excites him the most? Because Kaiser, after struggling to make an impact on the game, managed to grab a spectacular goal once he narrowed his desires down to just one, his desire to be loved. He had the realization that to go further, he couldn't continue to hold on to all these other desires, like his feeling to protect what he had or drag others down. And the next goal comes from Rin, who returned to his destructive impulses and aberrations back from when he was a child to get an equalizer. But what's Isagi's deepest desire? Because following this, Loki, Noah, and most importantly, Igaguri all sub on. Okay, on a serious note, Isagi's tried to face off against the other masters before, but whilst he did manage to stop Prince's shot in the Manshine game, there was still a giant gap between him and them. And whilst we did see his frustration at struggling to deal with Snuffy, I think he kind of knew that he was never going to actually beat these guys. You know, obviously Snuffy has a solid 20 years more experience on him at a much higher level of play. But unlike any of the others, Loki is the same age as him. And it's also immediately apparent that he doesn't have an answer for this guy. You know, even against Snuffy, he had that slight defense in using Raichi, but he doesn't have any ideas for the overwhelming speed of France's God Sprinter. They might be the same age, but they are worlds apart. And this speed is something that Isagi could train for his entire life and never match. It's exactly as he says, this is a wall of talent that he just couldn't surpass. And within about 30 seconds of him substituting on, his pass to Rin almost ends the game. You know, if anyone other than the greatest of all, Igaguri, was in defense with his surprise Malika technique, the game probably would have ended right there. But the point being, with Noah's admittance that he only joined the league to spur Kaiser on, two things happen. Firstly, the most raw desires of everyone on the field is laid bare, and secondly, Isagi falls miles behind. So far behind that in comparison to these monsters with their absurd, unmatchable talents, with their incomprehensible impulses ingrained into them, he can't visualize himself winning against them. They seem to have something that he just couldn't ever learn to replicate. Noah loses all interest in him, and Bastard Munkin are barely scraping together a defense for PXG. Isagi's been able to get by with what he has until now, but against the very best in the world, against those gifted with things he could never obtain, he can't imagine himself winning here. as though he's finally hit the limit of where his logic and adaptability can take him. And at first, I thought we were going to get the age-old, very boring question of talent versus hard work, which I've honestly never found a series outside of Blue Lock or Haikyuu to handle very well. And the reason I don't like it is because it's obviously crazy to assume that those with talent aren't going to work hard as well. And as brutal as it may sound, I do also think it's kind of delusional to claim that talent and genetics don't matter. Obviously, sure, at a lower level, you can kind of like work harder than those who are more talented than you to catch up. But at this level, everyone is basically doing everything they can already. But Blue Lock takes a very different approach. It doesn't suggest the solution to Isagi's dilemma is for him to work harder, because again, he's likely already working as hard as he can. Instead, it suggests that there's more than one way to be talented. There's those gifted with abnormal physical abilities, the geniuses, and those who analyze and overcome them, the talented learners. Now, quite a lot of what I'm about to say hinges on the assumption Jinpachi makes that geniuses can't do what talented learners do. You know, that they can't learn in the same way that they can, as though having this kind of abnormal physical ability prevents someone from thinking the same way someone like Isagi does. I suppose the explanation is that a prerequisite to being a genius is having a level of obsession with your own ability that somehow prevents it. Isagi does kind of talk about this in 282, where he says that the world style and a talented learner are the same thing, and notably that pursuing meaning and relation to oneself is what produces a genius's inspiration and unthinkable inventions. But I'm personally not completely convinced by this, and yes, I'm aware I'm kind of expecting this edgy football manga to apply directly to real life a lot more than I maybe should, but I still think it's something the series will go further in depth later. And Rin is possibly an example of someone who can do both, which is maybe why Isagi struggles to comprehend him at times, as he doesn't currently fit neatly into this framework. But regardless, I really love a lot of what Blue Lock says, that in the face of that horridly unfair, unsurpassable genetic wall of talent, it's as Jinpachi says, the world doesn't just revolve around geniuses, they share the stage with talented learners, and so don't try to become a genius. I mentioned Haikyuu earlier, and although it's under quite a different context, there's a quote which sums it up really well. Know your weaknesses, accept them. Forget the weapons you can't wield, find all the ones you can, and carefully, persistently, hone them all to a wicked point. Even without a natural gift, being a talented learner, one who's willing to analyze those around them and learn what they can, and able to quickly take all of that on board, is just as capable of reaching the top as someone born as a genius. It's not a hard work versus talent situation, it's two different types of talent, neither of which is better than the other. And what follows is probably the most interesting moment in the entire series. Isagi's realization that Kaiser, who held his own against the very best in this age group, started being most effective in this match once he dropped his obsession with Isagi, once he started applying himself purely logically and not letting any other desires get in the way. Jinpachi has always pushed for everyone at Blue Lock to chase those kind of desires, but here's the first bit of evidence for Isagi that it might not be the best way for everyone. If a genius is led by their strongest impulses and desires, then a talented learner works best when they drop all of them and work towards a single goal. If they thrive when working towards a single measured result, then they just shouldn't allow anything else to get in the way of that. They should narrow things down to a single objective. And the interesting question here is, if Isagi can only pick one thing, much like Noah asked him to all the way back in 199, what would it be? What's his real strongest desire? What's his true ego? Because before Jinpachi told him to live only for his goals, before Japanese soccer told him to play for his team, his strongest desire was to win. And again, as Noah said in 199, anything more than that is just noise. It's being too greedy. And so all of this culminates in Isagi's resolve that he'd sell his soul for victory. His personal grudges, his pride, none of that is as important as him simply winning. It's as logical as it gets, and I'm really curious to see where this goes in the future, because it's obviously the complete opposite of how Jinpachi described the best strikers in the world, e.g. Noah being happy losing as long as he scored a hat-trick. But with this newfound mindset, in a moment that genuinely made my jaw drop, in front of an audience of millions watching at home, Isagi tells the man waiting at the very top of the world that he'll be the one to take the next World Cup. And it doesn't feel like a bluff. His confidence in this has been growing since his first discovery of Metavision, and this combined with his two-shot volley has given him the two pieces he needs to take on the world. And so now, besides his opponents, the biggest thing getting in Isagi's way right now is his feud with Kaiser, which he finally puts aside by offering the team up, and the difference is immediate. The pair working together, unsurprisingly, are significantly more potent compared to when they were fighting each other. And with Isagi in 291 doubling down on his strengths as a talented learner, grasping and understanding the field as quickly as possible, the exact quality that makes someone talented at learning. Now, don't get me wrong, it is of course a little bit funny that the answer to his problem was just stop fighting your teammates, bro. But although they're on international TV, I can still see why this took him so long. His hatred towards Kaiser, the way Jinpachi encouraged him to chase and obsess over these kinds of desires, and also just the fact that he didn't really have much choice for a lot of the NEL. Unless he wanted to give up on his striker dream, Kaiser and his followers were never going to pass to him. He didn't really have a choice but to kind of conflict with Kaiser a bit. So don't get me wrong, it's still a little bit funny, right? But there's definitely a lot of reasoning behind it. And it's become one of those lines in Blue Lock that just kind of pops into my head occasionally. I'd sell my soul for victory. Now, obviously, maybe don't discard, your morals and things like that. I'm not naming any names, but I know there's plenty of YouTubers which have done that. But it's more that it's easy to let dumb stuff get in the way. Like what people think of you or whatever. And it also opens a really interesting discussion point on whether Jinpachi and Isagi will go separate ways in future. Because if winning is more important than scoring the winning goal to Isagi, that makes him the complete opposite of Noah, who, according to his quote in episode 1, would rather score a hat-trick and lose than assist to help his team win 1-0. That's the kind of striker Jinpachi wants to create, but that likely wouldn't satisfy Isagi because, he'd have to be kind of insane to actually prefer that. And from looking at how Noah didn't have an answer for Snuffy, the man who's on his way to winning every major European league, and how after discarding that urge to be the star, Isagi managed to get ahead, or at least compete with, players that he just wasn't able to previously. And so it makes me wonder where all of this is going now that Isagi's had this full circle moment of initially overly playing for his team back with Japan's philosophy. I know that his pass in episode 1 was the right call in that situation, but he didn't make it because of that. He just did it because he was told that he should. He was selfless for the sake of being selfless. And now, having tried overly playing for himself because Jinpachi told him to, and making these irrational moves for the sake of scoring himself, he's obviously found a bit of a limit with that as well. So will he continue to do neither with this new philosophy of selling his soul and doing whatever is needed to win? Personally, I'm really excited to see where that goes, especially as we now have all of the Blue Lockers back together on the same team, but that's for another time. Returning to the match, it concludes with Ness's awakening, and Ness is honestly the star of this chapter for me, and absolutely deserves a video of his own for it. But his pass is aimed at the new emperor, intended for the best in the world to come and steal. And with his recent string of failed plays and Kaiser parting ways with him, no one expected anything from him. No one except Isagi, who, unlike Kaiser, saw him as an equal, hiding his potential. And dropping that malice towards Ness let him get there first, ending the near egoist league as unbeaten champions, being able to finally throw Kaiser's initial words right back in his face, and finally reaching number 1 like he'd always wanted, even if it is tied with Rin, which I know a lot of people didn't like, but personally I thought it was fine. However, there's one part I want to focus on. Before the rankings are revealed, he thinks to himself, if I'm not number 1, then it's meaningless. And I am aware that what I'm about to say is maybe reading into things a little bit too much, but I just can't shake this feeling that I have about all of this. So I've spoken a ton about Nagi in his following chapters and how it mirrors a lot of Isagi's journey, so I'm going to jump ahead to chapter 301, which has a couple really interesting parts. It's the Blue Lock Parade, where Isagi finally realizes the size of the stage he's been standing on. He marvels at how incredible the world of sports is. It can turn someone into a hero so quickly, but it can also take it away just as fast as we've seen with Nagi. And of course, I just spoke about Snuffy, but exactly that happened to him. He got all the glory and fame, made it all the way to the very top, and then lost it all. And the thing is, looking at Isagi here, he talks about how he can't let himself get satisfied until he becomes the best in the world. And as mentioned in 295, for that it's meaningless if he's not number one. And there's maybe some link to Hiyori's parents' story here, who both reached second in their respective sports, but instead of being proud of their achievements, felt so disappointed by the fact that their medals were silver, not gold, that it caused them to live vicariously through their son in such an awful way. It's as though they had that exact same thought. It's meaningless if I'm not number one. But above all, I can't help but be reminded of a certain character when I read this. One that we don't see a lot of, but one of his few lines is basically the exact same thing. Mick Moon. Now, I'm not expecting the same ending for Isagi, don't worry. But what I am interested in is how becoming the best in the world has now gone from being a dream for Isagi initially, before Blue Lock, then something that he was aiming for. But now, it's more of an obligation, especially now he's kind of declared it to the entire world. He now seems to feel like he has to become the best rather than just wanting to. And just in my own experience, that never ends well. It's not satisfying when you reach it, and it's devastating when you don't. I don't know whether any of this will play out in the series. There is of course the part in 304 where his parents remind him, no matter what happens, your mum and I will still be here for you to return to. And I do personally struggle to see Blue Lock ending without Isagi facing a major defeat at some point. Blue Lock doesn't shy away at all from just how difficult the journey to the top is, so I do think that line from his parents is going to come up again at some point. But I do think this is the final piece of Isagi's brain, and of Blue Lock's kind of messaging as a whole, that I'm super curious to see, because I've spoken a ton about everything I love about his mindset and the resolve to not be satisfied with where he is, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for someone capable and willing to aim for the very, very top. But we've seen how wrong that can go if it doesn't work out through Mick Moon. And we've seen Isagi's reaction anytime something went slightly wrong just in the NEL. For example, threatening to outright kill Kaiser after Kunigami stole his goal. I get that people get frustrated in competitive sports and he's 17 years old or whatever, but honestly, Isagi does seem to have a bit of an issue of handling defeat. Remember the state he was in after losing to Rin for the first time? He's gonna face much bigger losses in the future. And I don't think that's necessarily a fault of him as a character. After he lost that first game, he was upset, but it wasn't anything like this. I think that's just what happens when you're chasing after something so intensely. And so I think when Jinpachi said 299 lives would be ruined, he might not have meant just the ones who get kicked out. And so again, the final piece of Blue Lock, which I think is going to have to be addressed at some point, because there's still a solid number of Blue Lockers aiming for number one, is how does one aim for number one with the intensity required for it and still stay sane, stay healthy if it doesn't work out? Because obviously for 99.9999% of us, and obviously the rest of the characters, that's going to be the case. But I don't have anything else to say on that for now, besides what I said in my Snuffy video. Let me know what you think of it below though. Ending the video on a more positive note, I do genuinely see Isagi as one of the most inspiring characters I've seen in my life. Someone who, outside of the, calling people your finest clown and stuff, honestly has a brilliant mindset that is worth trying to embody. This definitely won't be my last video on him, but for now, thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.